Hello everybody, I'm William Osmont from farmerleaf.com, and today I'm in the Jingmai ancient tea gardens, and I'm going to tell you a bit about those gardens, especially what happened in the past 20 years. Many people think that the ancient tea gardens have been managed in the same way for thousands of years, and this is not exactly true, especially when it comes to the last decades. Okay, let me tell you first the situation. In the 1980s, those ancient tea gardens used to be very large, much larger than they are now. And in the 1980s, under Deng Xiaoping's government, there were plans to modernize agriculture and introduce cash crops to farmers. They were going to plant sugarcane here, and they have no land for that. So where were they going to plant sugar canes? In the ancient tea gardens, of course. They cut a lot of those. Actually, those ancient tea gardens here are still alive today because there's no irrigation here, and to grow sugarcane you need a lot of irrigation. So that was in the 1980s. At that time tea was really cheap and it wasn't seen as worth it. Actually, they also started planting modern tea plantations, also known as terrace tea plantations or Taidicha. That was also in the 1980s that they developed a lot. And that tea from young tea trees was bought more expensive than the leaves from the ancient tea gardens. At that time, these ancient tea gardens had no value at all. The farmers only picked them twice a year, just as a side income, and they used those gardens to put their cattle in. They used to have a lot of animals to help them with the farm work, because at that time they had no tractors. As you know, the price of tea started to increase in the early 2000s here. That means a lot of change for the farmers and for those gardens. Let's get back to the situation before 2000. At that time, the ancient tea gardens are managed in a very extensive way. The tea trees are only picked, they are never pruned. They were only picked twice or three times a year. The weeds are cleared, but not that thoroughly. There was a lot of cattle in those ancient tea gardens. As soon as the price of tea started to increase, the farmers would dedicate more and more time to this crop. Also, they would be able to afford tractors and motorbikes, which means they didn't need that cattle anymore. That cattle was seen as a problem in the ancient tea gardens for the farmers, because they estimate that it decreases the yield of tea, because the cows, when they don't have enough grass to eat, they would eat the leaves on the ancient tea gardens. They would also potentially damage some of the branches, some of the lower branches, by bumping their head into them. Another problem with the cattle was that by eating the good grass, they would only leave the most thorny and thick plants on the ground. So they got rid of the cattle, at least most of it. They sold it in order to have more money to invest in tea production and mechanization. In the early 2000s, the price of tea was higher and higher every year, and the farmers felt that pressure to increase the yield in the ancient tea gardens. So what did they do? They dedicated more time to the ancient tea gardens, first by tilling the ground every winter, which would make more nutrients available, but is very labor intensive. Second, they would also apply light pruning to some of the trees in order to promote growth. They also employed more workforce for weeding, which means there would be less pressure from the weeds, and that would also promote tea growth. By doing all these things, they managed to increase the yield. Oh, and another important thing, they planted a lot of small trees. By increasing the plantation density in the ancient tea gardens, of course, they would get more yield. That's why also nowadays there's that distinction between old trees production and ancient tea gardens production. Ancient tea garden production, we call it gushu, so that means that you harvest any kind of tea trees, and they have that danju production, which means single trees, which means you actually only harvest the largest tea trees in the ancient tea gardens. So that switch in the agricultural practices was a huge change for the tea farmers. In the past, they were very diversified farmers. They would grow cattle, they would grow pigs, they would grow upland rice, they had paddy fields, they had sugarcane, corn, etc. And nowadays the main activity and 99% of their income comes from tea production. They are nowadays heavily specialized, and that specialization process occurred during the 2000s. So now, what about the tea quality? Does it have changed? It's pretty hard to say. Why? Because in the past you couldn't find any pure gushu productions. All of the tea leaves were blended in big factories. In the past, the processing skill of the farmer was really bad. They were paid like about $1 per kilo of tea, so they're not gonna work really hard into making the best tea possible. And anyway, that tea would be blended in big factories along with many different mountains from Monghai to Lincang. At that time there was no real pressure on the farmers to make good tea. So nowadays many tea buyers like to have that difference between single trees production and the standard gushu production, which means that you pick any tea tree in the ancient tea gardens. And personally, I think single trees production have a better huigan, you know, more of that fresh feeling in the throat and maybe a stronger body feeling, but they are not as good on the fragrance side as the standard gushu production. But let's be clear, the ancient tea gardens are still managed in a very extensive way today. It takes much less work than the natural tea gardens, well, which require a lot more workforce. Like in 1 year maybe you can harvest them 10 to 15 times, while the ancient tea gardens are harvested maybe 5 times a year. Anyway, the plantation density is much lower in the ancient tea gardens. So even though each tree takes more time to harvest, you will harvest 1 acre of ancient tea gardens much faster than you harvest an acre of natural tea garden. But of course the revenue per acre is much higher for the ancient tea gardens, because the price of the raw material here, I mean the fresh leaves, is at least 5 times more expensive in the ancient tea gardens than in natural tea gardens. So in a future video maybe I will talk more about the natural tea gardens. Thank you for watching this video. If you liked it, please share it with your friends, and see you next time.